You may or may not have seen over the last couple of days that there's been a good bit of chat, yet again, about David Haye and his supposed return to the ring. Now, this is something that's come up over and over and over again, and I've probably been one of those who's been guilty of doing 2 or 3, maybe even 3 or 4 videos about David Haye, the return, when will it happen at all, am I excited? And the truth is that he's kind of been delaying and delaying and delaying. He's been out of the ring for 3.5 years. He's a guy who relies on speed, who's now in his mid-30s, who's been inactive for so long. Yet if I'm honest, the idea of the return of Mr. Haye still is enough to bring excitement to myself. You know, put simply, he is one of the most exciting athletes who compete within our sport, certainly within Britain, if not globally, I guess you could say. Now, recently he took to Twitter and he said, who would people like to see him fight upon his return? Now, this led to a number of fighters putting themselves forward. So we had Martin Rogan, Mark Demori, Malik Scott, and Tony Bellew. So some interesting characters there. Let's talk through them briefly. Martin Rogan, for me, you know, even if David Haye was to return, which is a big, big if, that's a definite no. That's a definite no. Martin Rogan, I don't know how old he is, but I'm assuming he's in his 40s now. The guy is operating well below British title level. You know, you look at guys like Hughie Fury, Dillian White. These are the sort of guys who are, you know, you pick to handle Martin Rogan with relative ease at this stage. So the idea of David Haye, Martin Rogan, it looks like a hopeless mismatch. And obviously, you know, that's taking a lot. You know, we're taking a lot for granted about David Haye. He might have got old overnight. He might have been out of the gym. His style may not have aged well, especially combined with 3.5 years in activity. You know, so it's a difficult one to assess how good he'll be. But if David Haye returns at even 75% of his previous capability, Martin Rogan's no match for him. Yeah. As for Mark Demori, I appreciate he's got a better record in terms of wins and losses. I know that he's ranked pretty highly in some organisations, but essentially this is a guy who's never fought anyone, and who's probably more of an accomplished bodybuilder than he is a boxer. You know, for me, it's kind of hard to see that fight generating interest. It's kind of hard to see that there'd be demand to see those guys square off, if that makes sense. Malik Scott, for me, that is a more interesting one. You know, Malik Scott is coming off what I guess you could say is a career best win against Tony Thompson. A win over Malik Scott at this stage probably does put you in the top 10, top 15 of the heavyweight division. You know, Malik Scott has been operating at a decent level, has got some pretty good form with the likes of Tony Thompson, Glasgow, etc. You know, I know obviously the big concern is that how durable is he? Can he take a punch, etc. We saw even Tony Thompson was able to track him down and hurt him, and you know, drop him. Derek Chisora, not known for his knockout power, was able to stop him. Obviously, Deontay Wilder got rid of him in a single round. So there would be some sort of big questions about whether that's actually a competitive matchup and whether Malik Scott could last any time with David Haye. But he's certainly a better name, and he's operating at a higher level than Martin Rogan and Mark Demori. Finally, let's talk Tony Bellew. Now, a lot of people scoff at Tony Bellew, and you know that I'm one of Bellew's harshest critics. I think he's a very, very overrated fighter. But the more I think about it, and I've been thinking about it for 24 hours, I actually don't totally rule out the David Haye versus Tony Bellew matchup, as crazy as that sounds. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I think it's going to happen. I'm not saying it's likely. I'm saying I don't completely rule it out. And let me tell you why. To an extent, I see this matchup as mutually beneficial. Firstly, let's talk the division. You know, David Haye is viewed as a heavyweight, Tony Bellew is viewed as a cruiserweight. seen some debate online as to whether David Haye could still make £200, and I'm pretty sure he could, looking at him. But I think that question's irrelevant, because I don't see David Haye coming back at cruiserweight. I see David Haye coming back at heavyweight. That's the glamour division. That's the money division. David Haye obviously will look at the big fights: Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder, Vladimir Klitschko. That's the sort of money he's going to be fancying, not fighting Krzysztof Glowacki, or Marco Huck. So I think the question as to whether David Haye can make £200 is irrelevant. I think the question is, can Tony Bellew make heavyweight, and would he make heavyweight? And I think the answer to that is yes, definitely yes. We know Bellew competed at heavyweight as an amateur. Let me say, I've heard he's even struggling at the weight now at £200. We know after the Nathan Cleverly weigh-in, he put on a substantial amount of weight between the weigh-in and the fight. We know that one of his other fights was actually at a catchweight in the heavyweight division, over £200. It was to an extent where I don't know the exact details, but one of the fights after the Cleverly matchup was something like a £205 catchweight. Tony Bellew is a guy who walks around in the low £200, as does David Haye. And I think that whether David Haye would make £200 is perhaps irrelevant. It would more be a heavyweight matchup. Now, what does Tony Bellew have to lose? Yes, he is probably in a position where if he's successful against Mateusz Masternek, he could get a cruiserweight world title fight. But those aren't glamorous fights, are they? Bellew versus Lebedev, Bellew versus Glowacki, Bellew versus Drozd. Those aren't glamorous fights. Those aren't pay-per-view fights. Those aren't fights where Tony Bellew is going to make enough money to be able to retire off. And they're fights he's probably going to lose. I'd have any and all of those guys as a big favourite over Tony Bellew. I wouldn't give Tony Bellew any more than 10-20% chance of winning any of those fights, because, let's be honest, the guys at cruiserweight are pretty decent fighters, and Bellew's inaccuracy and defensive frailty would be most likely too much to overcome in order for him to get his hand raised in those matchups. Now, David Haye would also be, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying David Haye is a more winnable fight, but at least you've got the dynamic that he's been inactive for so long, that he's been plagued with injury, supposedly. What happens if in that fight there was a recurrence of an injury for David Haye? Or what happens if in that fight David Haye's inactivity caught up with him and he got old overnight? Which is not impossible for a guy who was trademarked by speed and athleticism. Maybe this is the right time to catch David Haye in his mid-30s, having been out of the ring for so long. Maybe Bellew would actually have as big a chance of beating David Haye. But I think a fight against David Haye is bigger and better for Tony Bellew than even a world title fight in the cruiserweight division. It's going to be more money. You can see Eddie Hearn having that on pay-per-view now. It's going to be more glamour. And it's generally going to be more of a recognised top quality fight than if Bellew were to fight for a version of the cruiserweight world title. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if David Haye is going to come back, wouldn't David Haye be quite keen for that matchup? Surely David Haye is going to want to return for an easier fight, for a guy who represents a winnable challenge, but he's also going to want to return on a big scene, isn't he? He's not going to want to be fighting on some Box Nation undercard and an 8-rounder against some heavyweight who's flown in from the middle of nowhere. He's going to want to be in an event, and love him or hate him, rate him as a boxer or not, Tony Bellew can certainly provide that event. So for me, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that this match does take place at heavyweight, because I see Tony Bellew losing when he steps up to fight at world title level. So with that being the case, he may as well lose to David Haye at heavyweight on Sky Box Office in a big fight than lose to Krzysztof Glowacki for 50 grand or whatever it is. Anyway, I've talked for 10 minutes. I've given David Haye probably more time than he deserves, and I know it's just another crazy theory about him and Bellew, but don't rule it out. Eddie Hearn's talking about it. Eddie Hearn was mentioning it on an interview he did on YouTube the other day. He was tweeting about it. And Eddie Hearn's a guy with a relationship with David Haye, so don't completely rule it out. Will David Haye come back? If he does come back, who will he fight? Let me know your thoughts. Many thanks for watching.